And we're back. Talk about timeliness. Our next session is titled To Engage or Not, the Impact of Social, Cultural, and Political Issues on Brand Reputation and Stakeholder Expectations. And we have with us John Bradbury, Partner and Managing Director, Global Issues and Crisis Management for Ketchum, and Tamara Norman, Partner and Managing Director, Corporate Reputation and Employee Communications for Ketchum. As we go, please type your questions in the chat area and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the presentation. Tamara, have at it.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks to the conference board for including us in this very relevant and very timely event. John and I are so pleased to be with you all today. You know, when we initially planned this session a few months ago, we were confident it was relevant and topical based on our experience over the past couple of years. But we couldn't have known at the time actually how topical March 9th would be, and certainly from a global perspective. So, to engage or not? During our discussion today, we aren't going to give you an exact answer to that, right? It's different for every company and scenario. But what we are going to do is discuss the environment in which leaders and communicators are operating, how these current dynamics are having an impact on corporate reputation. We're going to give you some ideas around the questions you should be asking, tools you could be using, and how companies should be thinking about managing this brave new world. So before we jump in, we're going to actually do a poll to set the stage for today's discussion. So we have a couple of questions we want you to answer, and you should be able to easily respond in the tool here. So let's pull up the first question, and it's, in the last 2 years, has your company or organization taken a position on an issue or a topic that's unrelated to your core business? So we'll give folks a chance to answer. It's a pretty simple one, yes or no. And then we can see the results. All right, whoops, let's go back and look at that. It looks like the results are an overwhelming yes. The next looks like 79% of yes. So the next question is, on what kinds of topics? So very curious to kind of see where folks are leaning in terms of the kinds of topics that you're having to respond to, because we're well over 70% of people that have had to do that. So maybe we can check out the answers into this poll and see where we're trending. Wow, okay, more than one, and social justice. Not surprising to see social justice so high, given some of the events, certainly that we've experienced here in the U.S. Over the past couple of years, and also really high in terms of it's more than one, right? It's becoming becoming commonplace that we're all having to speak out on these topics. So, okay, this was really great. Thanks for your participation. So, based on that poll alone, what we can see is that the dynamics of corporate reputation have fundamentally evolved, right? What it means, how it's influenced and impacted, and how companies need to think about it in the future. The mindset and considerations for managing reputation have also shifted, particularly with regard to reputation drivers, where we're focused in terms of stakeholders, and then as communicators, how we're responding and how we're approaching these dynamics. So, for example, for those of us that have been doing this for a very long time, you'll recall back in the day, right, corporate reputation was generally driven by products and services, financial performance, maybe strength of the management team. We were really focused then primarily on customers and the investment community as our primary stakeholders. And we often managed reputation with, one-way pushes of news and content and getting our executives out there. But what we're seeing over the past couple of years is that new drivers are emerging. ESG, corporate purpose, ethics, and values. These are really rising to the top in terms of having an impact on corporate reputation. And the stakeholder set that we're dealing with has also expanded to be a much more broad ecosystem, right? Employees, communities, business partners, suppliers, and also our communication strategies designed to impact reputation have evolved as well. Much more corporate storytelling, much more listening, one-on-ones, more dialogue, showing up in unexpected places. Now we're seeing corporate reputation driven, or at a minimum, being influenced by positions on issues that are completely outside of a company's core business. So a multi-stakeholder approach is required to be effective, and of course, ongoing engagement is critical. So these dynamics were shifting 3 to 4 years ago. We started to see that with our clients, but the global pandemic really acted as an accelerant, and certainly with what's going on today, we're seeing that just change rapidly and in real time. So the reality in which we're all operating and managing corporate reputation has become much more complicated and much more fluid.
So thanks, Tamara. One of the biggest changes that we're seeing is that a company's reputation is now really also reflective of how it's meeting stakeholder expectations. And those expectations are expanding and changing dramatically, and often frequently, really depending on the issue. I think first and foremost, the perceived role of companies has shifted. So, for example, in some cases, it's demonstrating leadership on cultural or societal issues. And in other cases, it's really about replacing or supplementing the role of government, either because of inaction, perceived ineffectiveness, or the perceived power of corporate influence to drive change. And we've really seen this more and more over the last 2 years, especially, again, in response to the pandemic, as Tamara mentioned previously. And it's continuing to evolve as we speak. I mean, just think about it. In the past 2 months, we've seen the systemic pressures being put on companies associated with the Olympic Games in Beijing. And it relates to their business in China and human rights issues. And we are all closely and anxiously watching the various corporate responses and actions, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These are very significant and weighty decisions and actions, but all with reputational implications. But it's really absolutely indicative of the new reality for corporations as it relates to reputation. So Ukraine, the corporate actions that we've seen thus far over the last week have really fallen into 4 categories. A withdrawal from the market, a suspension of operations or sales, or ending partnerships or suspending investments. Those that have laid low, taken no position, and a few that have publicly stated, no planned actions. And this is really changing practically by the hour. I suspect probably even during this discussion, it's been so fluid. We're seeing boycotts commencing against certain brands. Some of you may have seen, actions announced against Uniqlo and Coke, just to name a few. And these boycotts are also starting to gain momentum in other markets. And those may continue despite some actions, subsequently being announced, like Coke did recently. I did want to point out another important watch out. For those companies who've chosen not to do anything yet, or have done something as just a suspension or an end of a partnership, an additional reputational risk to be thinking about is the threat of sustained employee activism, by those who don't agree against the company externally. We're working with a few clients on dynamics like that, and it's something to definitely pay attention to. As expected, lists are being created, whether it's by media, key opinion leaders. There's one that's gotten a lot of visibility the last 48 hours from Jeffrey Sonnenfeld out of Yale, and also NGOs, really to try and drive visibility and to try and make comparisons around the various corporate responses. To be clear, these actions really oversimplify and in some cases sort of conflate the circumstances of very different businesses and operational dynamics across many different industries. But it is very reflective of this new norm and how this issue will play out reputationally. Finally, I'd really suggest that another dynamic for all of us to be thinking about is the potential precedent, being set here, where companies are expected in the future to play an even more active role in defining or influencing geopolitical solutions, strategies for deterrence, or even advocacy for change in areas typically reserved for governments. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. It remains to be seen what the business and reputational impacts are going to be from this issue, but navigating these choppy seas is really only getting more difficult. And for those of you who, I think very reflective of the poll, as if they weren't choppy enough already, the spectrum of issues and events that companies are being asked to or expected to have positions on or engage with is really far and wide. Everything from immigration matters, public health issues, and gender-related issues. Just this week, Disney sent a note to its employees addressing why it hadn't taken or spoken out on legislation in Florida that's generating a lot of controversy. And while I won't necessarily opine on that specifically, I think it really illustrates perfectly the dilemma companies are facing about whether to engage or not on these types of issues.
So why does this matter? This matters because companies more and more are being put at the center of an ongoing dialogue by multiple stakeholders. I'm sure a lot of you out there are feeling this. And while there is still a focus on many of the stakeholders that have always mattered, one of the biggest shifts that we've seen around the expectations and how companies should respond is that of the employee base. And that, I would say, that's both current and future talent. The rise of employee activism, as John just mentioned, right? It's become a real driver of change. It's a pressure point that I think is actually increasing within organizations. So companies need to focus on the impacts of their current talent, but also their future talent, and where prospective employees are, they're considering a broader set of criteria when choosing an employer. And this is certainly the case we're seeing with younger generations entering the workforce. They have very different expectations of companies, and as well as kind of what's going on right now with the great reassessment resignation. So all of this is shifting the focus for many companies. We're seeing our clients and many others really looking at the workforce as the #1 stakeholder. John and I were saying just yesterday that this current environment that we're operating in is really putting companies' purposes to the test, if you will. So with this in mind, we'd like to stop for another poll really quickly before we get into, so now what? What do we do? We have a couple more questions for you to answer, and then we'll get into the so what. The first one is, would you say that employee activism is having an impact on certain decisions, on how certain decisions are made within your company? So we'll take a look at the results. Yes. Okay. Wow. 70%. That's even higher than we thought it was going to be. Employees are really speaking out, putting pressure on leaders, putting pressure on managers. Okay. So if that's the case, let's also ask, from what stakeholder groups or sources are you seeing the most pressure to speak out? Sometimes it's not always employees. So from what groups are you seeing the most pressure? Answers are still coming in. All right, John, are we ready to see?
Yeah, I'll move it.
Wow. Okay. So most pressure coming from inside, right? So I think what that suggests is, as we're thinking about the what to do, which John is about to jump into right now, it really is, thinking about that stakeholder set and keeping the employees at the top of the list. So now we're going to switch into, with all of these dynamics, what do we do?
Okay, thanks. So what do companies do in response to these dynamics? How can you best navigate this environment? And what we really believe the most effective approach really requires two key elements. The first is a healthy mix of, what we call art and science, that's fully integrated, and I'll explain a bit more about that in just a moment. And secondly, it's about putting in place a consistent and disciplined approach to decision making. So in short, I'm sure this exists in many organizations. We make ad hoc, we have a typical sort of ad hoc approach that exists to decision making, where individual issues or events are evaluated by themselves or decided on, individually or in silos in various parts of the organization. So ensuring that you have a consistent approach to decision making is ultimately most important. So when we think about the art, what we mean is really focusing on creating a defined assessment process, which is really issue agnostic, and make sure that each issue or event or situation is evaluated the same way, using the same criteria all the time. So this approach includes, just for example, activities like initiating comprehensive stakeholder mapping. We've really talked about the importance of stakeholder expectations. So truly understanding and codifying and articulating what the stakeholder expectations about the company are in general, but also trying to anticipate what they are around specific issues and events. Because understanding these expectations are so critical to making those informed decisions about whether you are going to engage or not. And many times they may be at odds with one another, but ensuring that you have a very, very robust and informed view of that stakeholder expectation landscape is critical. It's also really about developing tools to use as part of the process. And whether that's to help determine sort of the reputational risks versus benefits of engagement or not, as well as those to prompt the right questions to make sure that you're asking and you're interpreting and evaluating issues and events. These are just a couple of examples of tools that we use with clients as part of the decision-making infrastructure and process. There are a number of others to use, but it's really about making sure that you make the most informed decision. So in addition to the art, it's critical to include elements of the science. We now have so many new analytics tools and technologies at our disposal to help make informed decisions about engagement or not. At Ketchum, we've made significant investments, to develop an analytics tech stack that can really help both with the preparedness process that we've talked about, but also understanding key factors and impacts once an issue is active. So, for example, issue velocity, to be able to measure and understand how issues may evolve in terms of scope and speed and scale, how they're showing up in the media and other online and other channels, how quickly they're spreading, and to which audiences, and how can we anticipate some of that, including at times very specific demographical information, and who of those demographics are engaging or reading the content. The second is really around behaviors. So being able to measure how certain issues and events are influencing stakeholder behaviors, everything from just general perceptions all the way to actions, and in some cases, including purchasing decisions. And lastly, from a long-term strategic planning perspective, using heat mapping. So understanding what issues is the company most vulnerable on from a reputational standpoint, based upon the landscape, the environment, et cetera. Where do we have strong positions? Where do we have weak positions or policies? And are we dealing with issues that are really unique to our own organization? Are they broader? Industry issues, or just general business issues, et cetera? But the point is, in all of this, is we now have so much more access to data that is absolutely critical to helping with ongoing corporate reputation, both enhancement and protection efforts. So in short, it's critical that we use it.
So we want to get to questions, and we know there's some that are starting to come in. So we're just going to summarize here some of the points that we've made. The dynamics here that we're all trying to navigate through are shifting, right? It's a tough environment out there. We've included some of those key questions that you should be asking yourselves, your leaders, to really to help navigate this environment. And, really quickly, it's, have we defined our purpose? What do we stand for? And is our behavior reflecting it? And how we respond to an issue, does that align to our purpose? Are we looking at all the new dimensions of corporate reputation and how we stack up? There's lots of tools out there that can help with that. Have we done that stakeholder mapping process to really understand what they expect of us? What's their mindset now, and how do we need to shift that? Just like John talked about, are we tracking those key issues and how those stakeholders that are important to us view them? What are their opinions on them? And then finally, are we creating criteria that support the decision-making process when it comes to deciding whether to speak out or to engage on an issue or not? And if we've done some of that work in the upfront, it makes those ad hoc decisions that John mentioned a lot less troublesome. So just a few areas that we're all living and breathing with clients each day. It's not an easy environment, and it's certainly an always-on one. So with that, I know we have almost 9 minutes left or so, so we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, great. We've got several that are pretty germane here. Let me start with the first one here. Any advice for global companies in how to consider taking a position on issues that are more driven regionally? And I might add country specific as well. Any advice there?
Yeah, John,
maybe I'll.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think the reality, again, it's going to depend on the specifics, but the reality is that we live in unfortunately, in many cases, a borderless issue environment, and so it is very difficult to isolate certain issues to specific markets or regions. And I do think, the most important thing is really to understand where there are regional dynamics, but also to understand how those can easily travel, and how, issues that may be affecting operations in one market or region can be interpreted in other markets or regions. So it's very difficult to answer the very specific question about what your individual situation is, but I think understanding that borderless environment is really critical, and that, particularly for multinational companies, to take a global view of the reputational issue landscape and understand how they can influence across borders and regions.
Okay. Sandra asks, what are the tech tools you've invested in to help in this area?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So, here at Ketchum, we've invested in, hundreds of different tools that, frankly, we've been able to put together in a way that work together. So there are numerous ones out there, but what they allow us to do is to, as John talked about, track the issue velocity, and how is the issue trending online? What is the tone of the issue? What are people saying? Is it building steam? Is it not? what kind of eyeballs are looking at specific media coverage, and even more importantly than that, how do we tell if that is actually having an impact on, something like a recall or, an environmental issue, and is it actually impacting behavior? So, Sandra, we could certainly put you in touch with our analytics team. They know a lot more about how their, how the black box of the tech stack works, but the data is giving us a lot more information now, not only just about how people feel and whether or not they're seeing anything, but if it's actually having an impact on business.
Okay. Megan asks, what is the best way to work with senior leaders who want to share personal opinions and thoughts on public forums such as LinkedIn, with the goal of keeping their voice authentic, but also in line with brand values?
Yeah, this is one that we've seen, I know, in recent, just most recently in the past few months, it's been popping up. I think, first of all, understanding what the personal opinion and thought is, and really understanding whether or not that's in line with the company's purpose and the company's brand values. So, and if it is aligned, how do you share that in a way that is authentic to the leader? And we do think that on certain channels, leaders want to have a point of view. And I think if it truly is a personal opinion, really being upfront and vocal about the fact that it is a personal opinion, and that opinion how that opinion might or might not align with the company is important to know in advance.
I mean, the only thing I might add that's really, really important is ensuring that there's a consistent and clear understanding about what sort of the rules of the road are. Again, I think sometimes organizations start trying to create policies based on events that have occurred, which is the wrong time to be doing it. It's making sure that there's a consistent and easily understood sort of approach for what is allowed and what is not. And I think to Tamara's point, every organization is going to be different. There are going to be, we find some organizations really try and, create a very narrow swim lane for activities versus others that are very comfortable with, people sharing personal opinions. And as long as they're clearly stated as such, that they don't have any concern about the perceived gap between, them and others. But I do think it's critical to ensure that there is a consistent approach that's developed and that is understood by all parties, and sort of building that at the time you're dealing with potentially a controversial problem is too late to be doing it. That's the wrong time to be doing it.
What about trade associations? Are they still viable? Where should they come in versus the company taking a position? Do you have any advice along those lines?
I personally think there's still a role for associations to address broader industry dynamics. I think it is much, much, much harder for companies to hide behind the proverbial umbrella of the association than it was a number of years ago. I say that as someone who worked in an association at one point in his past professional career and understands how those work. I do still think there's absolutely a role, though. I view it as supplemental, though, as opposed to in lieu of. And I think a number of years ago it was in lieu of, and now it's in addition to.
Yeah. Okay. And politics making strange bedfellows. Working with NGOs, any advice there? Let's say you were previously at opposite ends of the table, and now you're trying to engage with them. Any rules of the road? Any advice on how to do that?
The thing I would, and I'd welcome Tamara to weigh in here too quickly. I think some companies have to be comfortable to take a leap of faith that sometimes those partnerships can be constructive and fruitful. But they require you going in with an open mind and without preconceived notions. So yes, absolutely, there's a role to play.
Yeah, I would agree. Just keeping the dialogue open and really, communicating openly about what each party expects in the process, and that can help you determine whether or not it'll be fruitful from the outset.
Okay, we are out of time. That was a fast half hour. Thank you both. We really appreciate it. And to all of our participants, we'll be back momentarily. Thank you. Really appreciate it.